Throughout its history as a nation, the United States government has committed numerous atrocities and injustices against many of the peoples of the world. From the slave trade in the 1700s all the way to now, with the mass deportation of thousands of Latin American migrants. The United States and the overzealous people that live inside it have a history of acting first and asking questions later, or just not caring about the welfare of those that they inflict harm on. However, though it has always been too late, the United States government has come out and apologized for the actions they committed and or given a sum of money to those that were affected or to their descendants. With the exception of one group in particular, Black Americans have never received any reparations for anything that has been done to them over the country's over 250-year history. And while the ethnicities that did receive reparations did suffer, the scale, time, and severity of it pales in comparison to the atrocities that have been committed against African Americans. I am going to go over as many of these events as possible today to give you an idea of just how much is owed to Black people in America. This is Hidden History. So after I am done, I hope I have answered the question that was posed in the title of this video. Do Black people deserve reparations? If we're going to talk about reparations for Black Americans, we have to start before the slave trade even began. Hundreds of thousands to millions of people over a century were taken out of their homes, put onto ships, and displaced to an area where they could never return to their homeland, and further split from everyone they had ever known once they reached a foreign land. That by itself is more than enough for the United States government to pay reparations to Black families for the emotional trauma caused by the separation from their ancestral homes. The slave trade was thriving long before the U.S. declared its independence in 1776. Babies were torn from their parents' arms. Slaves were brought together for the purpose of mating and then separated afterward. Blacks in America, because that's all they were considered at the time, not even citizens, were forced to work back-breaking labor most of the day in the scorching heat, with only the scraps of what their masters ate as sustenance. Because female slaves had no rights, many masters decided to take advantage of their situation and pleasure themselves with whichever female they fancied. Because their master's rule was absolute, some slaves took the opportunity to improve their situation and become the overseers of their fellow people in the hopes of better conditions. They were not taught to read, they were not taught to write. The only skills that they learned, the only skills that the masters felt that they needed, were to plant, hoe, and grow. Slave labor was responsible for building the entire country, including buildings that have come to symbolize democracy in the nation. The Washington Monument, the Capitol Building, even the White House. And while, yes, the White House does have a white coat of paint, I cannot help but think that there was a double meaning in the U.S. presidential building getting that name. Slavery was eventually abolished in 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln, but to this day, not a single dime of reparations was given to those slaves or their descendants who live in the country today. And in my opinion, that is nothing short of a tragedy. In 1865, after slaves had finally found out that they were freed, the United States government under Abraham Lincoln tried to do right by them. At the end of the war, General William Sherman asked 20 Black pastors what they wanted for the Black people of the United States. The pastors came to the conclusion that they wanted land for themselves so that they and their people could live on it, away from the white population, as they believed it would take a long time before relations between them would be peaceful. In short, Black Americans wanted a community for themselves. So, General Sherman relayed this information back to President Lincoln, and 400,000 acres of land, 40 acres to each family, was set aside on the southern coast of the United States, taken from the plantations of white slave owners. The U.S. Army also granted Black families mules so they could work the land easier, and so the term 40 acres and a mule was born. It seemed that black people in America would finally be able to make progress. But then, that was when tragedy struck. On April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in the theater by a wannabe actor, John Wilkes Booth. The only thing more devastating than the leader of your country being assassinated is the death of a personal loved one, and accordingly, the entire country was shook. However, the vice president who was sworn in as the new president, Andrew Johnson, wasted no time in tarnishing Abraham Lincoln's memory by reversing everything he had worked for. The post-Lincoln era of American history was full of injustices towards African Americans, starting with President Andrew Johnson's reign of terror. The 40 acres and a mule program was quickly shut down, and the land was given back to its white owners. Throughout his presidency, he made it his mission to reverse every positive law that had been put in place for black Americans by Abraham Lincoln, including protections against black code laws that had been put in place in the South on his way out in 1869. And his legacy of racist policy continued to permeate even after he left office. The Freedmen's Bank, set up in 1867, only lasted for 6 years because when its headquarters was moved from New York to Washington, D.C., bankers and businessmen took control of the bank and used its funds for bad loans and risky investments. These bad investments were made using the hard-earned money that the newly freed black Americans put into this bank, specifically for their use. By 1873, the bank had been run into the ground, which went unnoticed by Congress, which was supposed to be overseeing the bank. Once they finally took a look at the bank's books, Frederick Douglass was brought on to see if he could possibly salvage the situation. But he later said that he was, quote, married to a corpse, and he asked Congress to shut down the Freedmen's Bank. Was there any justice for the African Americans that lost the only bank willing to house their money? No. A year after the Freedmen's Bank closed down, the Jim Crow laws were put in place. And from then until the civil rights movement of the 20th century, black people and white people in America were segregated, separated, and barred from forming any form of peaceful or positive connection. Lynchings happened by the day. Murders went unchecked. Massacres like the one that happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma came and went without any of the rioters involved facing any justice, and the few living survivors getting absolutely nothing for their trauma. You could say that after the civil rights movement, the situation of black Americans did get better, since they were finally allowed to do things in society without being beaten up or killed for it. But did things really get better? Black men have to look over their shoulder constantly just to make sure a police car isn't following them while they walk down the street. Black boys just minding their own business are exposed to the dangers and evils of the world far earlier than they should have been. A police officer kneels on another man's neck for 9 minutes, and people simply stand by, filming it with their phones, but not intervening to save a man's life. So we've looked at the situation for black Americans up until the present day. How does that compare to other ethnicities within America? First and foremost, we have to start with the Native Americans, as their land was stolen from them systematically by European settlers through wars and laws that they enacted. The U.S. government can never truly repay the debt that they owe to Native Americans without just giving all the land back, which is obviously not something an entire country with 300 million people in it is going to do. So instead, they set aside settlements for descendants of the Native Americans to live in parts of the United States. And these settlements have been maintained for many years. While this still pales in comparison to the suffering that was caused to them, it is infinitely more than black Americans have ever been given. During World War II, Asian Americans that lived within the mainland United States were arrested and put into concentration camps under fear of them being spies for the Japanese forces. Years after World War II was over, the U.S. government issued an official apology and gave survivors of the concentration camps and their descendants $20,000 per person. which goes to show that the United States government is capable of righting their wrongs. However, for black people, that does not seem to be the case. So now that I have given you all of this history, go down in the comments and you tell me for yourself how much you think African Americans should be repaid for the labor, service, and trauma caused by this nation. This has been Hidden History. Thank you for watching.